Tonight we'll look at the idea of secularism, and the big picture question that Strayer poses is a secular outlook on the world an essentially modern phenomenon, or does it have precedence in the classical era? So let me get adjusted here. I'm going to challenge you guys to start doing this because this is a major problem. If you decide that you're just going to read the textbook or continue to just look at what we're doing and not understand the words that you're reading, you're going to find that this course is going to be frustrating. But if you decide to, I don't know, maybe like try to look a few words up every time you're struggling with them, well, maybe this is going to be a little bit easier for you. Let's open up Google here, and I'm just going to type in the word secularism. Let's open it and see what comes up here. Wow, we've got Wikipedia. Of course, look at that. Look what comes up right away. It's this lesson. Now, why is that? Because it's searching for my stuff too. Google does that. It's set up for me. So if you see, there's my picture at the top. That's why it's doing that. However, you've got Wikipedia to look at here. If you go to Google and type define before this, well, you're going to find out that they're going to give you the definition right off the bat. Let's make it a little bit bigger so you can see it better. And this is pretty simple. It's a doctrine that rejects religion and religious considerations. Now, I think it's important to qualify this because just because it's saying that it rejects religious consideration doesn't mean that it is, in fact, being done by folks who are not religious. So keep that in mind. And I'll say that by saying this. If you consider the Greek world, especially Athens, where these great Greek philosophers were working, if you're thinking of that world as secular only, you're missing out on the true meaning of what it meant to be a Greek. Greek peoples did not even have a word for spiritual, and that's not because they weren't spiritual. They didn't have a word for religion. It's not because they weren't religious. Their cultural traditions were weaved and woven right into the fabric of their society. Every place you looked, there was some sort of sacrifice to the gods or ceremony or situation that was completely for the benefit of their religion. So I'm saying to be careful with that idea because it wouldn't be true if you said the Greeks weren't religious. It was a very religious society. However, the breakthrough that the Greeks make is in deciding not to include that in what they were doing with a scientific or rational look. So let's check this out, because this is an interesting question here. You could maybe argue that it isn't something that occurred during the classical era if you wanted to go that route and say that society was so dominantly religious because they did not quite understand the world around them and they had to come up with some reasons for what was happening. But there were some serious, more secular looks at the world that came about because of this very difficult time period. And remember, we're talking the classical era here. This is 500 BCE to 500 CE, the age of empires. And we talked Persia, ancient Greece, and their battles, the Greco-Persian wars. The Chinese are a massive power in the east. India is very powerful with the Mauryan dynasty and some of the other advances that they make. And of course, later we'll have the Roman Empire, which includes all of the territories we've been talking about, including Egypt and the eastern part of the Mediterranean, and Greece. So there are some serious, powerful empires here, and along with it, as we watched some in class with Andrew Marr's video with the history of the world, his thesis on this whole idea was that this is a terrible time period. It's very unsettling. There's lots of death. So there's no wonder that people were trying to come up with ways to deal with their world and live through it in a better way. So two of the ways that came about, we're going to focus on both of them here in this answer to the question, are the philosophical systems of both China and Greece. And they're central to either way you want to go with this answer. In China, of course, legalism is a huge thing at the beginning of their dynastic reign, and when all of China becomes unified under the Qin dynasty and Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, they are now one. China is, and his answer to holding that empire, making it strong and defending it, is to create this legalist system. In Greece, the philosophers of Greece, where, especially in Athens, where life was a little bit easier than a place like Sparta, where they had less resources in Sparta. In Athens, they had a system that enabled them, once they revolted against the tyrannies that had developed, to enable this amazing democratic system to emerge. So you had free thinkers, at least men anyway, and they came up with some new ways of looking at the world, more of a scientific or rationalist way of seeing the world. So let's look at this in a little bit better terms here. We'll focus in on the cultural tradition of the classical Greek peoples first. Greek intellectuals like Socrates, who is pictured here, his statue in front of the distant statue of Athena, who, the city of Athens is named after the Greek goddess Athena. So, I mean, it's dripping with gods and goddesses, the study of ancient Greece. So don't think that they're abandoning mythology altogether. But the intellectuals want to abandon that framework when looking for answers to how the world functions. So here's a few key factors to think of. The world is a physical reality governed by natural laws. Natural laws meaning like scientific laws, things that are taking place in nature or science. Humans can understand those laws, which that's a huge breakthrough just in terms of the thought process, because people felt in Mesopotamia, of course, as we've studied, that they couldn't quite understand why the flooding was occurring. They couldn't control that flooding. And so because of this uncertain world, they felt like the gods were sometimes very much against them. What the Greek rationalists are saying is that, no, there are reasons why some things may be happening scientifically. I don't think they're abandoning the study of gods and goddesses altogether, not the majority certainly, but they're looking at being able to separate science or this natural law from a religious or spiritual pursuit. Human reason can work out a system for ethical life. So this idea of being able to improve yourself and be ethically and morally improved and superior is something that they were searching for. They were looking for a way to do this. So Socrates kind of starts this. He is living in a time period that's difficult. He's been a soldier in wars. He has had an interesting life where he's kind of survived and made a name for himself. His main job is not quite philosopher, but that's what he does a lot of. And if you remember, like what we've studied with Greece, there were 2 slaves for every one free citizen of Athens, every free man. So the work that was being done in these times weren't always being done by the Greek citizens; they were being done by slaves. So he had free time to pursue these ideas of this intellectual framework for this world that they were trying to figure out. But he chose a way of argumentation and logic and questioning of received wisdom. And it's something that I sort of look up to quite a lot as a teacher. And Socrates, many people believe he's like one of the first real teachers in history, because this man pushed people to consider the world around them in a different way. He forced people, by questioning them about things, to try to answer it in their mind and as they were having the discussion with him. But these weren't easy questions he was asking either. So they were he was constantly pushing people to look at the world around them and challenge it. So this inevitably led to conflict with city officials And then the story goes that he was accused of corrupting the youth, which in some ways I kind of agree that he was. He was corrupting them from the societal framework that they had grown to understand. He wanted them to be challenging that, and he thought that there were some problems with Athens. It wasn't perfect. And he's your classic dissident, someone who's speaking out against the government. And as Andrew Marr stated in the first episode, when he looked at this one, or the second episode, how much are we willing to put up with that in a society? America's kind of similar. Is it okay for people to question their government? Are they a true patriot if they do? And especially at times of war and crisis. And we've seen that recently in your lifetime with 9/11 and what happened just after that. So these are really important questions that are still with us today. Of course, this picture at the bottom right corner is Socrates' prison, the place where this great Greek philosopher was poisoned and drank the hemlock in 399 BCE. Of course, he had a choice. He could have decided that he could leave and maybe even gone to like Sparta, who he had defended in some cases, or at least thought of them as in some ways better society, just in some ways. He could have left and gone to any other Greek city-state and probably survived and lived a happy life. But he chose not to, and he stood trial, and he stood and faced his accusers. And in a way, he drinks the hemlock cup knowing he's killing himself. We'll look at another kind of famous Roman person who does the same thing when she is questioned about her and brought to the sword of a gladiator because of her belief in Christianity. So that's coming up here as we study some more. Claims to be the wisest man in Athens, but knows nothing. And Socrates is famous for that quote, or the idea that he is only wise because he knows he's not. And it's this idea of philosophy, of looking at the world and questioning it, that sometimes, like, philosophy is kind of the hammer, and it can do some serious damage to your brain when you take it on and you're opening up your mind to new ideas and thinking of things. And I guess in this picture, like, the stupidity is the aspirin. You're going to take the aspirin. But in philosophy, if there's no pain, there's no brain. So your brain's not expanding and improving if you're not forcing yourself into some uncomfortable situations. Certainly, Socrates was good at forcing people into uncomfortable situations, probably to his detriment. As you see here in the famous painting by David from the French Revolution time period, he's looking back at this classical period. It's called the neoclassical era. And that kind of continued from the Renaissance. But there's the bottom. I know nothing except that haters going to hate, and that did indeed kind of happen. So you read about Socrates and Plato in your introductory to philosophy class. You must know everything now, and that's kind of funny because, Socrates claimed to be the wisest man in Athens, yet knew nothing. Hand me the hemlock. And this is something you guys say sometimes. I don't know what that means. But hey, maybe one of these days I'll force myself to figure it out. You only live once, so I might as well challenge myself. Socrates is remembered chiefly as a philosopher and as the teacher of Plato, but he was also a citizen of Athens. He served in the military as a hoplite, which is what a soldier is called, during the Peloponnesian War, which is the war between who? Peloponnesian War. Anybody got this one? This is something you should definitely write down because you may see this again. You've got the Greco-Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian Wars. So who's fighting in the Peloponnesian Wars? It's kind of tricky, but the Peloponnesus is this Peloponnesian Peninsula. That is like where Athens sits, and like all the Greek city-states are around there on islands and on that peninsula. And all of the Greek world was in a civil war fighting against each other. So Peloponnesian War is really the Peloponnesian world at war. Greco-Persian War, of course, before that, had to do with the Persians and the Greeks fighting. We looked at that with the Battle Marathon, and Thermopylae after that. Participated in, Socrates did, in the Democratic Council of 500, which if you were a citizen, you could go there pretty much on a weekly basis. And they would vote and rotate through, and everyone would get a chance to kind of serve in the offices of the government. He was one of the earliest classical Greek thinkers to apply rational questioning to understanding human behavior. But there are others that kind of were great thinkers of this time period too, like Herodotus, who we discussed, who wrote the Greco-Persian War. He is often called the father of history, but referred to sometimes as the father of lies, because there were some things he took liberty with and wrote about that maybe didn't exactly happen that way. Plato is someone that Socrates taught. Socrates taught Plato what he knew, and Plato wrote down the words of Socrates. Because Socrates never really wrote anything down. He was just walking around questioning people. Plato was the one that really put the pen to paper, or what we would do today. He outlines a design for a good society called a republic, which would be led by a philosopher king, which is really interesting because it's very similar to what Socrates was saying, is a democracy the best way to go here? Can we trust all the people amongst us? Or do some people really, should they not be involved with us, should they be represented by somebody else? And do we need a strong leader at the top to make decisions in time of war or to prevent some problems from occurring? Aristotle is the person who kind of follows Plato. He becomes the teacher of Alexander of Macedon, who becomes Alexander the Great. So you see this lineage flowing through. Herodotus writes about the Greco-Persian Wars, which Socrates reads about, learns about. Then there's Plato, who learns from Socrates, Aristotle, who learned from Plato, and then Alexander the Great, who takes these ideas and conquers Persia and all the way to India and all of Egypt and Iraq, Afghanistan today. And those ideas of the Western world, this new Western world, were able to spread. This is a pretty good one. It's from Horrible Histories. It's called I Am a Greek. We've seen some of these in class. If I've had a couple minutes at the end of the period, we've watched some of these. This is a pretty good one, so you can watch it in the notes. Let's break this down one more time. You see the poster there. As for me, all I know is that I know nothing. Socrates quote. And Aristotle wrote that teaching is the highest form of understanding, which I want to emphasize to you. If you want to really learn this unit well, make a study group, get together with other people, and teach them what you're learning and talk about it, because that's a good way to do this. Socrates is a sculptor mostly, but his true love was philosophy. He taught for no pay. Familiar. Well, not that I get no pay, but sometimes it seems like I do an awful lot of work, and the money just doesn't seem to be quite as much as I used to make in other pursuits. Anyway, he created this Socratic method of questions and answers, and I will do that sometimes in class. It's just what teachers do. Plato, and that's not Play-Doh, that's different, tastes salty, or at least that's what people told me that it tastes like. He's a student of Socrates. He's maybe the greatest philosopher of Western civilization. I've always said to students, why do you think that is? Why do you think Plato is the greatest philosopher of Western civilization, or that's what we think of him as being? Any thoughts, ideas on this one? To me, Socrates didn't write anything down. Okay, Plato's writing the things down that Socrates said, and he has the benefit of attaching his name to this as well, and learning from Socrates and then taking that a step further. And he does some amazing things. Unlike Socrates, he wrote down his thinking. Aristotle came next, the student of Plato's, and he has a wide-ranging amount of interests. And this is maybe your first real Renaissance man in history, because, and we'll talk about Renaissance men coming up here in this semester, but ethics, logics, politics, poetry, astronomy, geology, biology, physics. He is a man interested in all of these things and wrote extensively about them. Now, so that you understand how school worked back then, mostly it was done in a cave, in that kind of a situation. And they didn't have classes based on bells and subject areas. Like they would teach maybe a battle, like the Battle of Marathon, but they would use math concepts, talking about the 26.2 miles, or geometry and geology and biology, physics, those kinds of things would all play out in their teaching and their discussion of it. It's much more well-rounded in some ways and open and customized for the learning of the students who are there. Of course, then Aristotle taught Alexander, as we said. Let's kind of shift gears here a little bit, and we'll look at China. And it says, is a secular outlook on the world and essentially modern, or does it have precedent in the classical era? I think you can make another case that certainly Confucianism, at least, is seen as a practical and this worldly type of thing. So Confucianism comes first in China. It's primarily concerned with human relationships, effective government, and having this idea of social harmony. And harmony is very important because it's a chaotic time. It's a very difficult time. So the Confucian answer to this difficult time is, and I'm going to pull that up here, the main purpose, the main principle in the middle there, is the moral example of supervisors. And Confucius is very disappointed with those people in power or those people that he worked for. And his idea was that the people who have power in society, who are leading things and running things in the government, ought to first be chosen not because they're just family history, but they have become the best at what they do. And the civil service exam comes about because of these ideas, where you have to kind of prove yourself by taking a test to prove that you're worthy. This whole idea of education and becoming someone who's ambitious enough, those are the ones who should be rewarded, and not just people who are a friend of a friend or someone who is his brother-in-law or sister or whatever. This is, you've earned it by taking the test, and you're seen as someone who is worthy. And you should be then, in a way, worshipped or listened to at least and followed because you're someone who's earned it. And then also, you have a responsibility as a leader to then do the right thing for the people underneath you. So Confucius spent much of his time looking for this political position to put his ideas into practice, and that never happens. He ends up going on this sort of crusade in some ways. We see this with the Buddha before he becomes the Buddha. He, as Siddhartha Gautama, kind of wanders looking for the answers. I think Confucius probably feels like he had a lot of the answers. Now he's sharing them. And in doing so, his teachings were collected by students, and they compiled them in something called the Analects. And so basically it talked about how society consisted of unequal relationships. It's the duty of the superior member to be sincere and benevolent, and that he would inspire deference and obedience from inferior members. And he believed not in equality, he believed in stratification, that there were leaders at the top and you needed followers to do as they were told to do, and then earn their way to become the people who were running things. He did believe very strongly that humans have a capacity for improvement and for improving themselves through getting a quality education. He believed that family was the model for political life, with a focus on filial piety, which is honoring one's ancestors and parents, and they do this in a specific way. A defined role of the woman as being the humble servant to the husband. That is a little tricky for us in America today. We don't really think of it that way. So this is interesting. At the bottom right, you've got some interesting cartoons you can take some time to read. And on the bottom left, you've got the School of Athens. So we're bouncing back and forth a little bit here. But one of the things we're going to look at here is this idea of Greek thought. Also, in a way, being focused on education and questioning. So Greek thought, with its emphasis on argument, logic, relentless questioning of received wisdom, confidence in the world and in human reason, and an enthusiasm for puzzling out the world without much reference to the gods, also provides a precedent for modern secular outlooks on the world. And we certainly have some modern secular outlooks. There are people who are very strongly faithful and a strong religious situation. However, their job as a scientist or their job as a teacher, in my case, would mean they need to set those personal beliefs aside when they're doing their job and look at the world in a way that's more of an educated view, where you're trying to rationalize out what you're seeing and viewing instead of just putting your own personal spin on things. Another way to say this is it's a non-supernatural outlook, and that's basically, I think, how Strayer refers to it quite often. Flipping back here to China and kind of bouncing both of these ideas back and forth here. In China, legalism is also something that possessed several features of a modern secular political philosophy. It relies on law and on enforcement to have a stable society. So there's Confucianism at first, but when the Qin Empire is created under Qin Shi Huangdi, you have a system, where the leader is pretty ruthless, not the kind of leader that Confucius would have valued or liked. He would have held him to a higher standard than that. The first emperor was really ruthless. In fact, he went so far as to try to ban Confucian thought, burn books, and bury members of the elite educated class who had and kept books on Confucianism. Of course, we know today that even though the first emperor did all these things, they were not able to stop. They were not able to stop this momentum of Confucian idealism and this adoption by the Chinese people. Today, it's still a strong, valued moral and ethical foundation for Chinese behavior. On the right here is two representations of what modern Chinese society and cultural traditions are kind of based around. The foundation is, of course, Confucianism, which is initially the first real philosophical thoughts that are coming out of China. Then you've got legalism, which I like that the chains popped open there at the end, because no longer super attached, but I think you can see legalist tendencies throughout society, whether you're looking at our school and tardy policies or ID policies and dress code or whatever, or if you're looking at the world and the world of laws and enforcement that we have. And in China today, they're a pretty strict society. You can't search for the word democracy on the internet, on Google. They have some really strict ways of looking at the world in a legalist kind of way. Very difficult to political prisoners or people who speak out against the Chinese government. So in a lot of ways, that's just echoing what Qin Shi Huangdi had done originally. And then Taoist perspective, which emerges under Lao Tzu, and he is a person who says, really, it's a counter or argument to Confucianism. You don't need to be so focused on work all the time. Taoism is a way that is almost like a reaction to Confucianism. Taoism took things in a different direction, a completely different direction. At the bottom is a picture that is in Strayer. This is really a good image here. It's got a picture of the three representations of Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism. And so you can read about that part in your book, but this is both of these images on the right help to understand this a little bit better. So what the key thing here is, why are these things emerging? Why are so many religions and cultural traditions emerging during this time period? It's because they're searching for order. They're searching for some kind of way to understand the world around them that's a very difficult place to live. So China had a state-building tradition that goes all the way back to 2000 BCE under the first emperor. They had this mandate of heaven philosophy, which we're going to discuss some in class, that was a foundation for the Zhou dynasty, Z-H-O-U. That whole idea of the mandate of heaven is this cycle of empire, and you have to rule well or the people will rebel against you. This broke down into chaos and into this period of time, about a 300-year period of time called the Age of Warring States. And who rises out of that was the first emperor. But Han Feizi was this leader of the legalist philosophy. His strict rules clearly define and strictly enforce the answers to the problem of the day, which is disorder. And this is a very pessimistic look on human behavior. Only the state can act in the people's long-term interest, and they have to have rules and laws to be enforced to do that. This also promoted farmers and soldiers who performed the only essential functions in society according to the legalist perspective. And legalism inspires the Qin dynasty and the reunification of China. I know it looks like Qin dynasty, but it's Qin. Just like Zhou is actually Zhou, or Zhou is actually Zhou. You'll get it. So that's our quick look here, and you've seen a little bit of Confucianism, legalism, and of course Greek rational thought. So you're left with this question: is a secular outlook on the world an essentially modern phenomenon, or does it have precedence in the classical era? Very possibly this kind of question could come up on an AP test, certainly, because the classical era is pretty popular on the AP test. But the key thing to understand here is probably you're going to have something in here about cultural traditions. And remember, that's the buzzword for potentially religion or some of these other outlooks that we've mentioned here with the secular world. We'll come back in a few minutes, and I'm going to do a video that will focus in on why religion had such a huge appeal during this time period. So lots of questions that are fueling our notes for Chapter 5